In this video, we're going to look at creating ramps and the structure of ramps here in Mind Workstation. So a ramp requires two nodes, and keep in mind that when there's two nodes, this is considered the segment between them. And technically, this is a ramp between them, although it's a straight flat line. But a ramp, as we normally use them and recognize them, requires that you shift the position of the second point upward or downward. So this would be a ramp going upward, and this would be a ramp that goes downward. And of course, the closer that the ramp is to the starting point, the faster that it climbs or falls, depending upon its position. And that should be intuitive from the visual standpoint. So at this particular one, it's ramping from 10 hertz to 12.25 hertz over 39 seconds. So just keep that in mind. Now, there are various types of ramps in Mind Workstation, and ramps are created by default whenever you create a new node. So if I create a new node here, a ramp is created by default, and the type is a straight ramp, and it ramps to the next point. Now there is a preference that controls that. You can look under the track preferences here, ramp nodes by default. So if you wanted to turn that off for some reason, then you could. Because what happens when there is no ramp, like if I turn off this ramp to next, now keep in mind, it's the point prior to the ramp. In other words, it starts from and then goes to the following. That's the ramp. If I turn this off, what I end up with is essentially a jump, meaning that it's going to start at 10 hertz at 331, and then at 736, it's just going to jump right to 13 hertz. So there won't be any interpolation. Interpolation is the change between the two. You could also say animation, and I'm sure there's other terms. But there's not going to be any transition between these. It's just going to jump right to it. Now, that is when the ramp is turned off. All right, so if we turn the ramp back on, then we have the straight ramp returned. As mentioned, there are other types of ramps. Now, for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to create a downward ramp here, and we'll keep this one so you can compare the two. And I think I'm going to make it a little more steep. 7.5, and I'll go ahead and take this one down to 7.5 as well. Up one. All right, so let's look at the curved ramp type. The curved ramp in this configuration is no different than the straight ramp. And that is because the spline points here are set at 50%, at which they are by default, both X and Y. Now let's look at what that means. In the entrainment track video, I demonstrated how that this is just a graph. All right, so this is the Y-axis and this is the X-axis. So if we consider the graph, we're going to focus on this section here. If we consider the graph being a graph from here, from node 2 to node 3, then along the y-axis, this spline controller is at the midpoint. All right, and this little square here is the spline controller. Now, along the y-axis, it is also at the 50% point. In other words, it's centered. So when the spline point is centered, we have a straight ramp. All right, now let's look at moving the spline point and see what happens. So if we move the spline point here, we're creating a curve, and we're either creating an exponential curve or a logarithmic curve. What this means in practice is when this downward curve is steep, then it's going to quickly ramp down to, in this case, around 8 hertz very quickly over a short period of time. So what that means is from here to around 8 hertz, just over this minute and a half or so, it's going to drop down very quickly. Then it's going to level off and go much slower for the remaining duration of the ramp. And you can see that visually. Let's just see visually how this curve goes. So the opposite would be true here. It would change slowly at first and then drop right off. Drop right off immediately. So depending upon how you look at it, you are creating exponential curves, exponential drop-off points. Now you can make that a gentle slope, which just gives it a nice little smoother curve, or an upward, a nice smooth little drop down. Now these things can be good for crossfading, where you're getting shapes that move across. When you have two tracks that are fading from one to the other, they can assume a curved roll. So this just further expands your possibilities in using curves, and Mind Workstation makes it easy to do, keeping in mind that all you need to do is select the point that you want and select the curve ramp. So you can obviously have a mix. This is a straight ramp, this is a curved ramp, and they're mixed together. All right, now let's get a little bit more precision so I can demonstrate the steps. I'm going to delete this node here, which I need to know over a particular period of time. So I'll set this back to 10, and then I'm going to set this one to 07, okay, over 3. I'm going to make it 3 minutes. All right, so 3 minutes. 10 to 7 over 3 minutes. So if I choose this prior node and I change the type to steps, then the default of 2-minute step length is not really what we want. The reason I set things up that way is because we could do a default of 1. And then you would see that over each minute, it's stepping downward, very similar to what happens if we don't have a ramp, except now it's divided in parts. So what you'll see that'll happen is it's going to go from 10 hertz, it's going to play that for 1 minute, and then it's going to immediately drop down to 9 hertz. And it's going to play that for a minute, and it's going to immediately drop down to 8 hertz. Play that for a minute, and then immediately drop down to 7 hertz. So this is a nice way to create stepped entrainment type session. And it's got a lot of use in pitch tracks and things for musical notes or harmonic type notes. But it can also be useful in the entrainment track if you're just trying to target specific bands. However, you do need to do just a little bit of math to figure it out. If I went down to 0.5 minutes, 30 seconds as the step length, now it's going to create 6 steps. All right, so it's going to move a half a hertz at each step downward. And you could extrapolate from there how mathematically that works out. As you saw before, it doesn't have to necessarily be an equal measure, but the effects aren't as predictable. I mean, they are in the sense that you can see from this that over 10 minutes it's going to stay at 10 hertz, or over 2 minutes it's going to stay at 10 hertz. Then it's immediately going to drop down to 8 hertz. Then it's going to stay at 8 hertz for 1 minute and then drop down. So you can create asymmetrical steps if you wanted to do that, just by changing the step length. So in a quick summary, three types of ramps. As you can see, they can immediately convert from one type to the other. If you go from the straight to the curved, then you wouldn't immediately notice a difference because of this setting in the spline points. And the spline points need to be set by dragging is the most intuitive way, but just know how it works. I think this video will help you if you study it a little bit. It's a little bit more technical and math oriented, but it's good stuff to know. And then the steps. And the steps can be asymmetrical, as they are in this case, or they can be symmetrical by just calculating the math between them, how many steps we want. This is 3 minutes, so I knew that it was 3 hertz over 3 minutes. Well, 1 minute step length would give me 3 steps. And so I hope that's clear. If not, ask some questions. Most importantly, play around with it till you get a feel of it. That's the bread and butter of each session, is the number of ramping nodes. Now, as you can see, what I have selected here is going to be the default of what's created. So if I had straight selected, then it's going to make a straight one. If I have curved selected, it's going to be for the next point, then it's going to create a curved one. At first you won't see that it's curved, but it is indeed. All right, so you can create very intricate shapes is the point. Within Mind Workstation, you have a huge variety of options to create very intricate sessions. Does that make it any more effective? That's a question for you to determine.